I think we're going to get started with our last session of the day. Thank you for making it all the way here with us, and we're all really excited to sort of share our last couple of offerings with you, but not to finish the conversation. All right, so we'll just jump right in. And fair warning to all of the presenters who come up here, there's a very bright light right up here, so feel free to... Cool. That did not help.
We should move it over. Have the projectors away.
Okay. That's not going to work, I think.
No? Okay. How about like here?
Just... Okay, if this doesn't work, we'll move it up more. But, webcam good? All right. Cool. So let's just jump right in to our last session. So the first paper here is Adam Paradis, who's giving a paper called Political Economy in the LIS Professions, Acknowledging, Naming, and Closing the Gaps in LIS Education.
Recording started.
Thanks. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah? All right. Okay. Yeah, I have a lot to talk about, and some of the stuff on the slides I'm just going to have to skip over, and I'll let you know. And I apologize for my PowerPoint because I'm bad at PowerPoints. I think that's a cop-out in 2015, but it's true. I had a chance to read down here, on my way down here on the train, a paper put out by the Journal of Librarianship and Scholarly Communication called Commodification of the Information Profession, a critique of higher education under neoliberalism. I found it a couple weeks ago and finally got a chance to read it. It's worthwhile for our purposes here. They articulate late in the paper the section called Critical Theory as a Challenge to the Commodification of Information. They write, we posit that critical approaches to LIS practice provide a means to challenge the neoliberal forces that reinforce social injustice through the commodification of information. I think that's a good place to start, because I think that's what we're all trying to do here a little bit. We're all a little fed up. So thank you all for having me. I thought that was worth acknowledging to open up our session with. So political economy and library science. How are we to approach the gaps in library science curriculum if they go unnamed and unacknowledged? Moreover, how are we to name them when we are already immersed in the professions, when the purpose of our training is precisely to be immersed? As in most things, immersion is necessary, whether or not we are conscious or attenuated to the gaps. More often than not, we are not attenuated to these gaps. Yet I would argue that the gaps are sort of necessary for immersion. So we can point them out perhaps after the fact, but immersion is absolutely necessary, and I hope to show why. So to begin, I'll offer a critical appraisal of the library science professions. And in this instance, I'm relying on an understanding of what I would call the quotidian, like work and production. I think it's too often that theorists theorize, say, archives and don't actually take account of what it means to work in an archives, to remove staples or not, or restrict materials or not. So the actual work and production, I think, is very important and often missed, also by people within the profession when they theorize their own profession. So hopefully we try to remedy that a little bit. So I offer a critique of the present political and economic moment so that we can fully situate our work and production within society, not just at a local and particular level. We are immersed in our professions, and we must be to function, as I say. Librarian, I believe he's a public librarian, or he's theorized public libraries quite a bit. His name is Douglas Raber. He characterizes this necessary immersion when he writes that critical questions regarding our own role in the problematics of the hegemonic bloc, dominating society, capitalism, misogynistic, white supremacist society, all those sorts of things that we encounter. This immersion, we accept its legitimacy and see no reason to question its means or its ends. Our roles and functions in the profession become natural and naturalized. The immersion of ourselves and our institutions is always political and ambiguous. We'll probably say that till the day I die. And we are always already immersed, whether or not we are conscious of ourselves as workers. Got it. So which professions am I focusing on? I'm not focusing on the data people. I just don't have a foot on the ground to talk about them. I think they're problematic and worth considering especially when we talk about, how we get our degrees and so on. So I'm not talking about the data people, and I'm not talking about the museums people. I think they're worth considering, but I just don't have the expertise. So I am focusing on libraries and archives. I treat them both, but I acknowledge well that there are major incongruencies between them or among them. For example, the service profession elements that we see in librarianship are not entirely absent in archives and special collections, but they're certainly absent in archival processing, for example, especially the way when it's done by student work and so on. Information retrieval is different. Patrons' needs and expectations and projects they're working on are different, markedly different. But I still think they're worth considering because you go to library science school and you can end up in either or one of those trajectories. Information literacy is also different too, primary sources and so on. But we can ask the questions of both. Whom do we serve? What is produced and what are we reproducing? And what is obscured when we're immersed in these professions? And again, I need to point out that we must be immersed in our professions. We do learn practices and protocols when we're in library school, and there's a necessary sort of bracketing off of general categories of society. Just to get it working, to become trained, and to become professionals, we have to bracket off those questions. We do it all the time, and it can be a problem. If we can assume the curriculum of the U of I, for example, is paradigmatic, we are introduced to the profession by way of early classic American liberalism. John Stuart Mill, for example, one of the first things we read of liberty of thought and discussion from On Liberty. Also stuff like Faith and Reading, Public Libraries, Liberalism, and Civil Religion, which talks about the inculcation of morals, liberal values, tolerance, so on and so forth. The moral education of the American populace. Although much of that is paternalistic when we encounter it now, liberal progress for a handful of people, which we'll talk about what kind of people those are in a minute, it's not so bad. Liberal progress is not so bad. And so we are introduced to the professions from this selected history that situates us seemingly unproblematically in American democratic liberalism. So what gaps in our education? Necessary gaps, as we come to find out. There are many gaps to be confronted. Hopefully you all encountered some today. Problems of diversity and tokenism. I say the problem of diversity in the sense of problematizing representation within the profession, and then the attending problem of tokenism and, hey, look how diverse we are, sort of gestures that people make. Women, people of queer orientation or identify as queer in some capacity, persons of color and administration and management in our classrooms and as our colleagues. Expanding services to meet the changing needs of patrons, the unemployed, the unemployable, so on, and the problem of microaggressions within the profession. So we are organizing these conferences, journals, and so on at the grassroots level to combat these. They're positive moments, I think, things like this symposium. They're necessary auxiliaries, as the Fitz people point out. But I think they also belie something interesting about our LIS education, and that the education equips students in only a narrow way, necessarily. We particularize our consciousness necessarily so that we can do our work, so we can learn tech services, we can learn cataloging, and so on. And so we're forever supplementing once we're in the workforce. I think that's just the state of affairs without a value judgment. However, the logic of our professional training, the economy of our training, makes it necessary to obfuscate our roles in society. I should say obscure our roles in society and forget the present historical moment, relying so much on the mill and the moral education of the populace, which I think is dying because of our present economic and political situation, which, So our focus today is I want to talk about work, like I said, work and labor and production. The producers, what is being produced and reproduced. And I think that needs to be taken into account in the present historical moment. So some of the things I think characterize the present historical moment are crippling debt, including absurd amounts of student loan debt that we incur to become part of the profession, staggering economic inequality with increasing consolidation of wealth and capital at the top, disinvestment through neoliberal policy that diminish our public services, including the institutions we hope to be employed in and through which we can serve folks. and the effects of debt and unemployment opportunities and how that affects our work. Second point is the effects of temporary and contract part-time arrangements and how those affect our work. I think they affect our abilities to properly execute our tasks, serve the public, and so on. Talk about that in a moment. Austerity in general and budget cuts. What we're doing more with less becomes the norm. LIS education might provide the qualifications for work, but it doesn't provide an account of work vis-a-vis the present moment. I quoted Douglas Raber in the introduction. Elsewhere he writes, the worker possesses and uses intellectual qualities. And he's talking about Antonio Gramsci here, the idea of the intellectual and how it's ubiquitous no matter where you are, no matter what kind of work you're doing in the countryside or in the city, and so on. Human activity and humans are sort of have this innate, they're always intellectuals. Here he's, I wrote that down. And I would say that by developing this political consciousness that I think is important as workers, I would need to apologize because it's egregious of me to not acknowledge the problem of advocating for critical librarianship or development of a political consciousness when it's on our own backs, where we would have to increase, what do we want? More student debt? We're supposed to, so I should apologize to you for that. And lastly, we can even cite examples that within the professions themselves, in this case archives, that denigrate work and denigrate labor. I think, for example, anybody here doing archive stuff or familiar with Society of American Archivists? Yeah? Yeah, so we President Catherine Rowe, this is her year of living dangerously. They give cute names to the annual presidencies. So May 1st is coming up, and we all know what May 1st is. It's International Labor Day. May 1st for Catherine Rowe and Society of American Archivists is also called May Day, but it's not a day to recognize and unite as workers, but a day to preserve collections, as in May Day, danger, and so on. The society that is supposed to advocate and support archivists effaces workers and solidarity. I find this troubling, but humorous. Naming the gaps. So our education focuses on the early classical liberalism. That's fine, because again, it's not so bad. But I do think that it misses an opportunity to articulate the present moment. Some of the things I just, sort of bullet pointed at you earlier. So some of the best articulations I think come from Marxian analyses, such as Herbert Marcuse, Zizek, Michael Hart, and Antonio Negri in Empire, and so on. They characterize the inescapability and ambiguity of our relationships to capital, to power, the state, so on. For example, in Empire, one of the things I think they pick up on, Marcuse did in the 60s, and it was taken up by other folks, is the remarkably non-coercive element of the dominating and the domination of the state of capital, the non-coercive element of it. So it's still dominating and hegemonic, but it's not coercive. I think that's a remarkable insight. In Empire, we have Hart and Negri talking about, in terms of resistance, I think they're re-articulating Marcuse here, especially the chapter in One-Dimensional Man. Are you all familiar with this or no? Yeah, One-Dimensional Man, the chapter where he talks about the ability of HR and management to, in effect, efface general workers' solidarity complaints and translate them into sort of particular fungible executable solutions, interpreting away the workers' class grievance for a more proximal one. So Hart and Negri, in terms of talking about resistance, also characterize the hegemony against which resistance may or may not be possible. How to determine the enemy, they say, given that exploitation tends no longer to have a specific place, and that we are immersed in a system of power so deep and complex that we can no longer determine specific difference or measure. We suffer exploitation, alienation, and command as enemies, but we do not know where to locate the production of oppression. There's a lot I would like to say about that. I think Zizek comes to bear a lot on that as well, but because of time and your patience, I will limit that discussion. But I think his own response and review of Hart and Negri's Empire book in early 2000s really captures that sort of way that, in a non-coercive way, the domination occurs, in the logic of that domination. He quotes Lenin and saying, Lenin's reproach to liberals and liberalism is crucial. They only exploit the working classes as an opportune way. They like to evoke racism, ecology, and so on to score points against conservatives without actually endangering the system that they benefit from. he recalls Seattle, the World Trade Center stuff, which might date. I understand the reference. I don't know if young people do these days. But he quotes World Trade stuff going on in Seattle, and he says, Bill Clinton himself deftly referred to the protesters on the street outside, reminding the gathered leaders inside the guarded palaces that they should listen to the message of the demonstrators. Bill Clinton said we should listen to the demonstrators. In parentheses, Zizek writes, the message which, of course, Clinton interpreted, depriving it of its subversive sting. It's the same with all new social movements, Zizek writes, to including Zapatistas and Chiapas, which become a very remarkable example in Hart and Negri's analysis as this thing that's counter to the hegemonic bloc, but also not fully outside of it, but still articulates its ya basta, right? Standing up for dignity and autonomy against NAFTA and the North Americans. Zizek goes on to say, even if one insists, the system is by definition ecumenical, open, tolerant, ready to listen to all. This is remarkable. The tolerance is the means of domination. That's part of the non-coercive dominating element. So we look to Raber again, because how does this apply to library science? What happens, what are the reprisals if we act out or act up? For LIS people, people with master's degrees, people with a certain range of phenotypical presentation, I don't think that's grammatically correct, but I think you take what I mean. You're light-skinned enough or not too dark-skinned, people not too far onto or within the LGBTQ spectrum. For those folks, immersion creates a situation in which a coercion is not necessary. Instead, discipline is enforced through various ideological mechanisms. Like, what's going to happen as a librarian? You might not get the grant, right? You might be blacklisted from job searches. You might lose funding within the profession, but such reprisals themselves are non-coercive because not receiving a grant does not deny us freedom of speech. The oppression, it takes a very odd ideological turn. So for folks who are considered a threat by power, well, it's pretty bad, as we can see on TV constantly. State violence becomes normal. I think library science education doesn't necessarily provide us with tools to deal with that. Or what does it mean to take a stand and lose a grant, for example? We might have take courses in grant writing, how to appeal to foundations, interests, and so on, but we don't necessarily read in those courses or in that coursework that foundations might be largely conservative tax shelters or money laundering schemes for the already wealthy, and that perpetuate the status quo. There's more we can say about that. The gaps. There's supposed to be... What number slide is that, do you know? Whatever. Now the gaps. I do think we are workers. That's important. We're workers. We have to make a living. We have families, partners, and so on. We have to make a living. Let's not forget that. There's a lot of people who are doing a lot worse than we probably are at the moment, and we're all workers. So what do I mean by political economy? I take it to mean that political economy is interested in a form of inquiry into the relationships between persons, the state, capital, production, so on. Economic and also political and social. Hart and Negri point out domination is nebulous and goes, I think, 5 minutes left. I have a whole bunch of stuff I italicized to forget, so let's do that. So, what are we producing and for whom? It seems that business libraries, for example, can answer that question a little bit better. Business libraries and archives can answer, it's a lot easier. I'm producing for a certain end to support your brand, to support your business. Academic libraries can kind of answer it a little bit better too. So the question of production and what are we producing? In public libraries, for example, I don't have a good answer for that, but hopefully maybe some of you guys do. And that's good. I think there's something peculiar about our relationships to production. And let's take the case of archives here. We learn in our archives management courses that policy is vital, standards are vital, and so on. It's worth framing the archival ethos, which I think is embodied in MPLP, which is more product, less process. And I think it's a symptom of efficiency and productivity that undermines in our actual professional mandates for accessibility and usability. Moreover, the problems of siloing the work of the processing archivist and her role in the production of an archives alienates her from the users and fountains of information that could enhance her work. Temporary and contract work precludes her from instantiating herself in the institution she is supposed to be describing materials for. By definition, she signs contracts. By definition, contract worker is economically constituted outside that institution. They're not an employee, right? And that's becoming the norm. It affects the work, it affects what's produced, and it affects the profession. And it also infects the institutions that the person is working for. You're not contributing to institutional memory, which provides good tools for descriptions, helping patrons and users, and so on. So, yeah. We also encounter the problem of work and labor and the quotidian in other ways too. I think a fun experiment for perhaps future LIS professors would be to think about designing a 16-week course on the mundane activity of archival processing, or design a class on sitting on committees with the faculty, or design a class on how to survive contract negotiations when a new governor wants to run the state like a business, which is clearly an absurdity, but apparently has some currency now here. On the other hand, design a class where we learn how to navigate the various roles in a library. How does tenure faculty, for example, make decisions, and how do those decisions denigrate civil service, student workers, and non-faculty librarians who still have librarians in title? How do contract and temporary adjuncts make decisions when they can't take a stand because their contracts might be up? How do we interact with one when you're the other? And how do you interact with the rank and file in civil service? I'm going to have to skip a couple of things, obviously, here. Reproduction. Rarely in libraries and archives are we ever starting from nothing. Institutions, I think, analytically, by definition, precede us because they're always already instantiated. We can see in archives how our work is fundamentally bureaucratic and reproduces governmentality, the systems of domination. By defining libraries in their liberal moment and hanging on to the value of a well-read populace as the noble goal that it is, and hanging on to the value of a well-read populace who will become morally upright while ignoring the unabashed dismantling of our public goods, our profession, our work. This is the kind of house cleaning you do when your car is about to be repossessed. It is a mistake to assume that Mill is still coherent in our time. I have stuff to say about the French Revolution, but I've had to cut so much stuff about the French Revolution out of this, and it pains me because I think it's very interesting. We can talk about it later. So libraries as intellectuals, like I mentioned, Gramsci, getting close, right? To time? 2 minutes? Great. The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci, what's that? Oh, okay. We're right on schedule. Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci provides two valuable things for our purposes, I think. Doug Raver really cashes them out, and it's a worthwhile paper. I'm happy to send it to you. I'll provide the citation after this. It's worth reading. He actually provides solutions, which is a good thing. First, Gramsci has a well-articulated understanding of class and how a person's relations to class, capital, and so on are ambiguous. I find that problematic in Hart and Negri, for example, and in Marcuse. Their responses tend to not, in my mind, deal with work, people who have to make a living, who have partners who might get sick, who have children who might get sick, and so on. It seems like they're dealing with artists, which is fine, but it's not a type of work that I do. The second most important thing about Gramsci, I think, is he develops his theory of intellectuals and his notions of class, attending to the ambiguity of power articulated by folks like Hart and Negri, how it's coercive, non-coercive, but dominating. So how does this apply to LIS professionals? As librarians, we have a unique possibility to inhabit different modes and subtle relationships to the production of libraries, but also to power and society. We may reproduce various elements of the non-coercive dominant bloc. With relative autonomy from state reprisal, for example, it takes a form of probably not violent, like actual violence and state violence, but maybe we won't get grants. Maybe we'll lose funding for projects and so on. We can do much work within our profession to serve the poor, to serve the unemployed and the unemployable, or not. we can serve this cadre, this class of people, or not, and we're still most likely fulfilling the job description we were hired for. We can collect and disseminate LGBTQ literature, or not, and we're still fulfilling our role that we were hired for, right? As we've said already, librarianship and the professions are located, according to Robert, in an ensemble of institutions, both public and private, constituting the means of sanctioning and distributing public knowledge in a capitalist social formation. And yet, the library is one of the least powerful institutions in that ensemble. One of the least powerful institutions that function to produce and reproduce the cultural hegemony of capital in the form of the book, information, the historical record. The least coercive of the dominating non-coercive institutions. It's actually quite powerless. Black Lives Matter and the Ferguson Library probably best exemplify the good work that we can do. The types of work that can be done, I think Ferguson Library continues to embody that to this day, by helping the community, highlighting the ambiguous, but they also highlight the ambiguous relationships we have to the state and capital, by providing services when other places were closed, by responding to the needs of the public, whoever they were, journalists and their own public, and in effect standing up to state violence by not squashing rebellion, by opening doors when others were closed, and so on, by being there, which is a big important part of activism, right? Just showing up and returning. They did a lot, and yet libraries cannot themselves prevent state violence. We can march and promote free breakfast programs, and we should, but we do so as librarians. Do we need to do so as librarians? Is it at all impossible to is it possible at all to incorporate solidarity into our fractured professional life? This is a pet project of mine. I can't talk about it. I don't have time. I planned on not talking about it. That's 2 pages worth of stuff. But it's something I really enjoy. Archives are founded on a promise. The promise is never fulfilled. I'm sickeningly proud of that idea. So solutions and blowback. One of my concerns is solidarity, obviously. It's not taught in library school necessarily because that's not the job of library school. It's something we have to supplement and work on. I don't mean the feigning concern for community that you see, but yeah. How do we work to eradicate state violence as it becomes normal and routinized? I saw it on the television today. How can we, as workers, hold our governments accountable as archivists and librarians and so on? As archivists and librarians. We know who Vern Harris is, you archivists, the South African whistleblower, becomes part of the Reconciliation Committee and so on. Tried to interpret a lot of Derrida for archives. I would argue that he wasn't, he was an activist, but at that moment he was not an archivist. He was a whistleblower. That's outside the purview of the profession, necessarily, which is part of the promise thing, and we can talk about that more afterwards. That's fine. I think one of the things we can do in terms of solutions, it's not a very good solution because I don't have too much content to it, but I think as people of means, when in terms of access to resources, not available to others, we can use those to funnel resources. I have a good example of that if anybody wants to hear it. But as we're getting to the end here, and again, I apologize because I think this is something we have to do on our own. I don't know necessarily if it is the job of a GIS list to do this because on whom would that burden be? People who are taking on debt like crazy. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Get the young people, children of the future. No, thank you very much for listening to me. No, I'm serious. Thank you all for your time. Any questions, please let me know. Anything that I alluded to that I didn't have a chance to talk about, please ask me now or later. Yeah, anything. Thank you all very much. Can we stay up here?
Yeah, we can take a couple questions, maybe 2 or 3 questions if we have time, and we'll start with Kim and then Jamie. And is there anybody online who'd like to ask a question so we could?
Some comments.
Okay, I'll read comments now. Maybe they'll help frame the questions. Martin says that it's really interesting to hear this U.S. political economy context, and sort of says that these neoliberal economic pressures are also really relevant in a European context. Aman says that last Thursday attended a queer studies presentation, and the non-LIS professor also used the Ferguson Library as an example. So, all right, Kim, I'm bringing this to you.
Hi, I'm Kim, Illinois student. So I had this crazy theory that that the reason why libraries aren't really valued in a capitalistic system is because inherent in that system is this hierarchy. And a lot of public librarians, their goal is to inform the general public. And having an informed public doesn't serve capitalism because the people that are exploited at the bottom, the more they learn, the more they will revolt. And I'm just wondering what you think about my crazy theory.
No, I don't. I agree with your crazy theory. In a word, I think Herbert Marcuse in One Dimensional Man, the second part of the book I don't really care for, but the very end of the conclusion is really smart. And he characterizes this type of people, like what does resistance look like for him with the New Left and so on. Like what can resistance possibly look like when everything is so flat and one-dimensional, as he explains. And he describes a whole cadre of people. It's like something like the people who are not of the right race, according to dominant ideology, but also the unemployed and unemployable. And we all know from any sort of Marxist or Marxian perspective, we know that capitalism needs its contradictions, right? But liberalism is the lie that everything can be included eventually, even as things get more granular and nuanced, right? So you're right to say that the uneducated whatever folks are necessary for the system. They don't benefit the system, but they actually do benefit the system, right? Because they are on the backs of whom the system can move the momentum up, unfortunately. That's just a brief way. So I think you're right, but also it needs, state and capital need that cadre of people. And it's kind of a middle finger, I guess, to them to reach out and serve them. Say, no, we will provide free breakfast, like what the Panthers were doing, right? No, we will provide the free breakfast. We will give job training, so on and so forth, and bridge those gaps that are created by capital and necessary for capital. So it's that weird how capital always needs its contradiction and there's no outside, but it seems like it's a failure of the state. I don't know, that's kind of a lot. Does that make sense at all? I don't think it's a crazy theory. I think it makes sense. It doesn't serve power, but it does serve power. Yeah.
Which is why further it makes no sense to think of the library as a business, because like what are we producing?
Yeah.
Like there's like the goal of the library isn't to make money. That's what I'm saying. The reason why it's so difficult for libraries to find funding, and the reason why I'm accruing so much debt and yet can only find part-time or hourly jobs predominantly, is because librarianship, particularly public librarianship, isn't a highly valued profession by our economic system because we need the uneducated to carry the burden of capitalism. So why would we want to provide social services to, for the betterment
Sure.
of...
But also capitalism also needs us to perpetuate and disseminate capitalist ideology too. So let's not forget that. But also, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, when do we talk about this? When do we talk about this in our coursework, where there's the move from patrons and users to customers? When did that happen, and why did that occur? It seems concomitant with the crisis of libraries and Google and so on and so forth. That's just my first instinct to associate it with that moment. But talking about the users and patrons as customers, that's clearly a reproduction of capitalist rhetoric, if not how we actually evaluate the world and engage with the world, right? That's baffling to me. Yeah.
As you were giving your talk, I was thinking about Michel de Certeau, and I was thinking about ways that this is Jamie Wittenberg, by the way, for our online people. I was thinking about ways that librarians and librarianship could develop practices or sets of practices for creative resistance in the practice of everyday life or everyday librarianship. And I was wondering what you think of that as a possibility to subvert the kinds of sort of seemingly immutable power structures that we're facing.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. Depends how I feel in the morning. You know, how much we can do. I mean, we can. How much time do I have? Sorry. Yeah. I say you can buy a bird feeder at the store. You can, build your own bird feeder. And sometimes it's better to make your own bird feeder, even though it's not as good as the one you can buy at the store. But there's something honorable and noble about that. But we should all know that might have certain consequences. If you want to operate outside of certain structures, that means you're not going to get grant funding. You might not get not-for-profit status because you don't have the muscle to do that, right? And that means that you are. I find something honorable in that. But I don't know. I'm a metadata librarian, and I'm confronted with this all the time. Am I out there passing out ACLU leaflets after the cop who killed Eric Garner was not sentenced? Am I doing that as a metadata librarian, right? We still remember it's 8, 8, and 8, right? 8 hours to work, 8 hours to rest and leisure, 8 hours to sleep. Maybe we should take that seriously, that perhaps our professions can't fulfill that activist role. And if we try to, we know that there might be consequences. So you asked that question earlier in the other session, right? About what do you do when you want to put on the display and you get resistance from your boss? Like, how much do you want to shake things up? And unfortunately, we need our jobs. Our partners could get sick. Children can get sick. We need to put food in our bellies. And perhaps we might be doing more good doing a free breakfast program and unhappy in our job, To be employed, we might be able to do more good. But, yeah, things are bleak. Thank you all very much. This is a beautiful thing, and we'll applaud you too. Applaud these organizers. Thank you all very much.
So it looks like there's some more questions, so maybe if we have some time left over at the end, we can kind of jump in and take questions for all of the panelists. And I just want to gesture towards the chat right now where there is a conversation happening about sort of the Canadian media portrayal or lack thereof of the Ferguson events. So, all right, I need my thing. Okay. Thank you so much for that paper. 2 microphones are bad. The most organized person. Okay. Next up, Kyle Shockey, who's going to tell us about intellectual freedom is not social justice, ALA accreditation, symbolic capital, and LIS curricula.